respects Article 5 of the NATO treaty, which is an attack against one is an attack against all. Russia is fully cognizant of the fact that if it attacks Poland or the Baltic states, it's at war with NATO. And they know what that means. But NATO doesn't respect anything about Russia. NATO knows no limits. NATO has been expanding nonstop. They lied about it, about not wanting to do it back in 1990 to Gorbachev. They've lied about it ever since. They've been expanding. But one of the whole reasons we're at war in Ukraine right now is because of NATO wanting to expand and bring Ukraine into its umbrella. So when Russia moved into Ukraine, it also had to mollify Belarus, which is very nervous, saying, well, okay, while you guys are down here doing that Ukraine thing, what's to protect us? What if NATO decides to come into us? So Russia put a marker down and said, if NATO decides to get involved in this, intervene, we will use all the means at our disposal to protect ourselves. And everybody went nuclear, nuclear, nuclear. And I'm pretty sure that Putin was sort of hinting at that, except that doesn't fit the Russian doctrine, and Russians are very doctrinal. There are other weapons that Russia has called hypersonics. See, we are trying to build a hypersonic. Russia has hypersonics. And I think what Russia was saying is we will take out NATO cities, NATO decision-making centers with non-nuclear means, all the means at our disposal. And Putin talked about weapons that are deployed, such as the Kinzhal or the Dagger, the hypersonic missile that's been used. NATO can't shoot it down. There's nothing NATO can do to do it. If Russia launches it against NATO, it will hit the target that it's aimed at. But they have other hypersonics, something called the Avant-Garde, which is currently deployed on ICBMs, intercontinental ballistic missiles. They have 3 to 5 Avant-Gardes per missile. They don't have to be nuclear. They can be non-nuclear. So Russia has the ability right now to fire a road mobile ballistic missile with 5 hypersonic warheads that can come down and hit 5 targets in Europe per missile. They have hundreds of these missiles. Russia can annihilate Europe overnight in a non-nuclear attack. And this is the message that Russia was sending. But we immediately said, no, that's nuclear. He's threatening the use of nuclear weapons. Russian doctrine is quite clear. There's only 2 conditions under which they can use nuclear weapons. One is if a nation uses nuclear weapons against them. And the second is if through conventional forces, nations threaten the very existence of Russia. Getting involved in Ukraine does not threaten the very existence of Russia, but it does threaten the very existence of Europe in a non-nuclear retaliation. But Europe misunderstood this, the West, and we've been hyping this up. Russia's made it clear. They will never, there's no circumstance under which they would ever use nuclear weapons in Ukraine, against NATO. They won't use a nuclear weapon in Ukraine. If it comes down to time to use nuclear weapons, they're not going to nuke Kiev. They're going to nuke London. They're going to nuke Paris. They're going to nuke Berlin. They're not going to nuke Kiev. So the West has totally misconstrued this, totally misunderstood this. And it's the West that's done the most aggressive behavior here. One, you have Zelensky giving a speech where he basically begs the West to carry out a preemptive strike, a nuclear strike, some people implied, against Russia to prevent them from nuking Ukraine. So Zelensky uses a false premise that Russia is going to nuke Ukraine. Russia will never nuke Ukraine. But to prevent something that Russia will never do, he wants the West to nuke Russia preemptively. And then a week after he issues that speech, NATO holds a nuclear exercise where they practice loading on B-61 air-delivered nuclear munitions on to aircraft whose sole purpose is to drop those bombs on Russia. And if you're a Russian, you're going, wait a minute, Zelensky just begged you to launch a preemptive nuclear strike, and now you're carrying out a nuclear exercise, which, gosh, if you wanted to, you could load the real thing on and carry out the real preemptive strike. Very dangerous situation. Russia responded by testing its own strategic nuclear forces, showing the world that we have all these missiles and we can use them and you'll die and there's no reason to do this. Both those exercises were planned in advance. These weren't something that were done because of Ukraine. But responsible leaders on both sides should have stopped their exercises. Russia didn't announce their exercise until the very end. So there's a possibility that Russia would have taken the lead from NATO. If NATO said, we're going to delay this exercise, Russia may have done the same thing. But now those exercises are over, and I have a feeling that more mature minds in the West are reconsidering what's going on. You hear some dialogue out of the Biden administration about we don't see any evidence of Russia preparing to use nuclear weapons. This is good. I think the more we don't talk about nuclear weapons, the better off we are. But eventually, we are going to have to talk about nuclear arms control. Bottom line is the diplomatic off ramp for the situation in Ukraine is probably best served by re engaging with Russia in meaningful talks about arms control. Perhaps breathing new life into the INF Treaty to prevent the deployment of Dark Eagle, to get the Russians to do whatever needs to be done to mollify the West, to walk us away from the edge of the cliff. We don't need to be standing on the cliff staring over it. That's not a good place to be.
Right. So I'd like to, in the time remaining to us, focus on uh, the question of, I mentioned at the outset, I'm in Montreal, Canada. I'm a Canadian. And I'd like to talk to you a little bit about Canada's relationship to NATO. And I'm going to offer to you a kind of contrarian perspective that is entirely non-military. I have absolutely no military expertise, never served in the military, never studied military science. I'm just a layperson looking at the lay of the land, and I have a certain view which you can't even talk about in the mainstream of Canadian politics. It's simply taken as a given that Canada should be a member of NATO and that being a member of NATO enhances Canada's security interest. As I look at it, however, uh, NATO undermines Canada's security. And the reason I say that is, first of all, I think, again, from a non military perspective, Canada has formidable natural barriers protecting it. It has the Arctic Ocean on the north, the Atlantic to the east, it has the Pacific to the south, it has the longest undefended border with the United States, but the United States government is supposed to be our ally. That's the official position that this is a country to which we are closely tied, which would never do anything to threaten the security of Canadians. And I think we all know that if Canada were to come under attack from one of the few countries that might be able to actually sustain an attack on Canada, despite these formidable natural barriers like Russia or China, the United States would not tolerate the presence of hostile military forces so close to its northern border. And it wouldn't take a treaty, a NATO treaty or any other treaty, to cause the United States government to intervene to bring that threat to an end. Now, conversely, because we now have signed on to Article 5, countries which are very vulnerable to attack, for example, the Baltic states, Latvia, Estonia, Lithuania, Ukraine itself, although it's not yet a member of NATO and hopefully will never become one, these countries, we have a reciprocal obligation of mutual defense. They probably couldn't come to our aid if we needed it. And we probably would never need it because we have the United States, in theory, protecting us. So, as I look at the situation, I think that there's no real upside for Canada being a member of NATO. There may be for other NATO states, but I can't see an upside and I can see a hell of a lot of downside. And I'm curious, with your military expertise, what would you say to Canadians about whether NATO enhances their security? Do you think it does? Do you think it doesn't? And if so, why?
Well, let's go back to the roots of NATO in the post Second World War. I don't think anybody who's knowledgeable about the history of the war in Europe can minimize the role played by Canada. Canadian troops were there in the fight, in the thick of the fight. Canada stood side by side with the United Kingdom and the United States in defeating, helping defeat Nazi Germany. Therefore, Canada earned a seat at the table of the post-war security framework that became NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And the Canadians maintained a permanent military presence in West Germany, I think in Lohr, and they were integrated, highly respected troops, very professional, and they continued to play a meaningful role in preserving the security of Europe during the Cold War. The problem comes when the Cold War ended. At that point, what role is Canada playing and why? What role does NATO have? When NATO stops being about preserving the post World War II security framework and becomes more about securing European stability, Canada probably needs to, at that point, start questioning why they're there. And then when Europe and NATO deliberately start this policy of expansion, and in doing so, basically empowering nations like Poland and the Baltics to call the shots. I mean, they're the ones on the front lines. They're the ones. Their voice is far more important than Canada's voice about Ukraine. Canada literally has no voice about Ukraine. I know Canada is providing munitions and stuff, but no one's listening to Canada because you don't get a vote. You're not there. I mean, yeah, I know there's some Canadian forces at the headquarters, and but what does Canada bring to the table? Frankly speaking, nothing. Nothing. That Canada can't bring anything to the table. First of all, for Canada to deploy troops to Europe, you need the United States. So in effect, you become an extension of the United States. You can't function without the United States. Um, and as you rightly said, let's say Russia, God forbid, decided to move on Canada from the north in the Arctic. Where's Latvia? Where's Lithuania? Where's Estonia? Where's Poland? They're not there. They're not going to be helping you. The United States will be. I think Canada would be wise to strengthen its relationship with the United States. Um, that means a bilateral security treaty with a guarantee of American nuclear umbrella to have the same Article 5 type protection, but with the United States, that an attack against Canada is an attack against the United States kind of thing. Um, and recognize that Europe had become a poison pill. I mean, the bottom line is there's no upside for Canada and Europe today. You gain nothing from that relationship. It only threatens you with war, and it basically gives a veto of Canada's very survival to Eastern European nations that don't have Canada's best interests in mind. Um, NATO is an organization that is long past its useful life. Um, it and that's being proven today. Um, First of all, NATO was humiliated in Afghanistan, and Canada played a role in the Afghan. I mean, again, I'm not denigrating the service of Canadians, but you didn't win. For what purpose were you there? It cost you a lot of money. It cost you lives, and to what end? And now we talk about what's going on in Ukraine. NATO's not going to win. They're going to yet again be humiliated. Canada has literally stripped its defenses bare, helping the Ukrainians. I don't believe there's anything left in Canada to give. Um, for what purpose? Russia's going to win. Russia has a legitimate interest in Ukraine. What interest does Canada have in Ukraine? Um, so I think from a purely um, Canada-centric point of view, um, NATO is very expensive and very dangerous and very risky, um, while maintaining a relationship with the United States is the smart thing to do, cheaper by far, and it entails virtually no risk because nobody's going to go to war against the United States, and therefore nobody's going to go to war against Canada.
Right. And I know we only have a few minutes left, Scott. So I'm gonna ask you a big question, which is going to be quite a challenge for you to answer within the limited time available. But what do you think a path to peace looks like in this extraordinarily dangerous war? And I'll try to narrow my question a little bit. Um, if the parties were minded to sit down at the table and have a serious discussion about a resolution of this conflict, what concessions do you think the Ukrainian side should consider making in the realm of reality? And what concessions do you think the Russian side could and should consider making within the realm of reality that might get us to a negotiated settlement to this war?
Well, the short answer is Ukraine's going to have to accept reality. It has permanently lost Kherson, Zaporizhia, the Donbass, and Crimea. You will never get it back, Ukraine. Never, ever, ever in a million years. And if you continue this fight, very soon you're going to lose Odessa. You're going to lose Kharkov, and you will never get them back. You will lose Nikolaev. You will lose Dnipropetrovsk. You will lose your very existence. You will never get it back, ever. Russia's reached a point where it is not in a mood to negotiate. What the Ukrainians would have to offer the Russians is a lot, which is recognition of all territory, a guarantee that they will never join NATO, and a concerted effort to eliminate the ideology of Stepan Bandera from mainstream Ukrainian politics. He's no longer national hero. Nazi symbology and parades will no longer be tolerated. Things of that nature. In exchange for that, what Russia can offer Ukraine is you get to live. You get to maintain your government. We're not going to remove Zelensky. We're not going to eradicate your parliament. You get to live, um, and we'll help you rebuild and we'll help you survive. But that's all we can offer you because, and basically, what the Russian position will be is if you don't accept this, then what we can offer you is death, and not just death of your soldiers, but death of the nation. You will cease to exist as a modern nation state. It will never, Ukraine will never again look like what you thought Ukraine should look like. Ukraine's lost the right really to negotiate a meaningful outcome. They had that opportunity on 1 April. There was the Istanbul discussions, and Russia was ready to back off this conflict and only take Donbass and Crimea. Russia wasn't going to take Kherson or Zaporizhia. Uh, but the Ukrainians bent to the will of Boris Johnson, who was acting on behalf of NATO, who said you can't get NATO military assistance if you negotiate with the Russians. So the Ukrainians terminated that negotiation. And here we are. You don't get a second bite at the apple. I personally believe that there is no off ramp that doesn't include total Russian victory. It's not Ukraine that should be looking for an off ramp. It's the West that should be looking for an off ramp. And the best off ramp for the West is termination of the conflict that allows for meaningful discussion of a new European security framework, one that doesn't require NATO to bankrupt itself by massing military forces in the East, one that encourages Russia not to similarly mass forces, one that recognizes the neutrality of whatever is going to be Ukraine when this is done, and one that de-emphasizes, conflict-based competition between NATO and Russia. Because otherwise, NATO is going to be caught in a trap of its own making that it can't afford and it can't win. NATO simply can't build up. I mean, all this mythology of NATO building up 300,000 men and pouring more with what money, with what economy? I mean, Europe is going through some very difficult times. The European economy is shutting down. There's no promise that it's going to reopen anytime soon. And without that economic base, how does Europe think they're going to rearm? How are they going to afford the billions and billions of dollars or euros necessary to do this? So the best path, diplomatic path, is one that recognizes Russian victory in Ukraine, but seeks to mitigate the harm to the Europe of that victory by negotiating a European security framework that respects the rights of everybody, except Ukraine, because they lost the war.
Well, it's been a pleasure speaking with you, Scott. We've been speaking with Scott Ritter, former UN weapons inspector, author, and his latest work, again, I'll mention, is Disarmament in the Time of Perestroika. I hope we can have you back on The Real News, Scott, to continue the discussion as this tragic story unfolds.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.